In a war whose entire outcome depended on staying invisible, one American pilot deliberately turned on a light. The night of September 14, 1951. Mountains near Yangdok in the interior of North Korea, roughly 100 miles behind enemy lines. The aircraft is a Douglas B26 Invader, a twin-engine bomber designed during the Second World War and already considered obsolete. 3 men aboard, and bolted to the aircraft, an experimental searchlight. Every man who flew night interdiction over Korea understood one rule above all others. You do not advertise your position. Anti-aircraft gunners cannot hit what they cannot see. The darkness that hid the enemy's supply convoys also hid the bombers hunting them. Darkness was the only armor a low-flying Invader had. Captain John Walmsley had already found and disabled an enemy supply train that night. He had put his bombs and his guns into it until there was nothing left to shoot with. His ammunition was expended. Nothing in his orders, nothing in doctrine, nothing in common sense required him to stay. He stayed. He radioed for other friendly aircraft in the area to come and finish the target, and then he switched on the searchlight and held it steady on the crippled train, flying straight and level above a valley he knew was defended so that another Invader could see what needed to be killed. He was 31 years old. He was on his 25th combat mission of the war. He flew for the 8th Bombardment Squadron of the 3rd Bombardment Group, and the beam of that searchlight was the brightest object in a sky where the enemy had spent an entire year learning to be invisible. It lasted long enough. The gunners on the ground found the light and they followed it up the beam to the aircraft holding it, and they hit him. The Invader went into the mountains and exploded. So here is the question that opens this story. Why would a pilot in a war fought entirely in the dark make himself the only visible thing in the sky? The answer begins with a number: 38,500. Before we continue, I want to ask you a small favor. This is a small history channel, and our reach has dropped sharply over the past few months. If you value carefully researched military history that tells you what the records actually say instead of what makes a better story, please subscribe, leave a comment, and share the video. Every single interaction helps this channel find new viewers and lets me keep making documentaries like this one. Now, back to Korea. 38,500 is the number of vehicles that the B-26 Invader was credited with destroying during the Korean War. Across roughly 60,000 sorties, the 3 Invader wings, the 3rd, the 452nd, and the 17th, were credited with destroying 38,500 vehicles, 406 locomotives, and 3,700 railway cars. It is the largest truck-killing tally in the history of aerial warfare. It is genuinely, verifiably, the official figure. And it is one of the most misleading numbers ever recorded in a military archive. Because the United States Air Force as a whole, across the entire war, claimed 74,589 vehicles destroyed. And the Chinese and North Korean forces in Korea never possessed anything close to that many trucks. The best available estimate puts the communist truck fleet in theatre at somewhere above 20,000 vehicles, continuously replaced from sanctuaries across the Manchurian border, which means the American air campaign claimed to have destroyed the enemy's entire truck fleet roughly 3 times over, and the supplies never stopped arriving. That is the paradox at the center of this story. It is not a story about a wonder weapon. It is not a story about a secret prototype or a decisive new machine or a technological leap that broke the enemy. The weapon that defeated the most powerful air force on Earth was not a weapon at all. It was darkness. It was a shovel. It was an army that had discovered it could survive on almost nothing. And to understand how 38,500 destroyed trucks could add up to a strategic failure, we have to go back to the moment the United States realized it had won the sky and lost the road. By the autumn of 1950, the air war over Korea was effectively decided. The North Korean Air Force had been destroyed. Far East air forces had achieved something close to total air superiority, facing little or no serious daylight opposition. American aircraft could fly where they wanted, when they wanted, and hit what they could see. That last clause is the entire problem, because the enemy responded to American air supremacy in the simplest way imaginable. He stopped existing in daylight. The change happened quickly, and it happened everywhere. Convoys that had moved openly in the summer of 1950 simply vanished from the roads. Pilots flying armed reconnaissance over North Korea in daylight began reporting the same thing again and again. Empty roads, empty rail lines, empty villages, nothing moving, nothing to shoot at. A country that appeared from 12,000 feet in the sunshine to have been evacuated. It had not been evacuated. It had been rescheduled. The official American assessment was blunt about how this happened. Night intruder operations were forced on the Air Force by the success of daylight interdiction. When the enemy found he could no longer travel by day, he began to travel by night and hide by day. American air power did not fail to find the enemy. American air power succeeded so completely that it drove an entire national logistics system into the one place air power could not follow. The Air Force response was to try to strangle the roads anyway. In May of 1951, Brigadier General Edward Timberlake, the Vice Commander of 5th Air Force, drew a band across the map of North Korea. It ran between roughly 38 degrees 15 minutes north and 39 degrees 15 minutes north, a strip of the peninsula about 1 degree of latitude deep. Inside that strip, every road capable of carrying supplies south to the front was to be cut and kept cut. The operation was given a name that promised exactly what it intended to do. They called it Strangle. Nothing was strangled. The road cuts were repaired, the bypasses were built, the traffic rerouted, and the traffic kept moving, and the 8th Army on the ground felt no meaningful reduction in the volume of shells and rifle ammunition coming the other way. The name was aspirational. The results were not. And it is worth pausing on the language, because the language is part of the story. The Air Force called it interdiction. The press called it a blockade. Neither word described what was actually happening on the ground, which was a race, night after night, between American airmen trying to break a road and Korean labourers trying to fix it. And the labourers were winning. Here is the image that captures the whole futility of it, better than any statistic. At one point, American planners concluded that if they could not reliably crater the roads, they could at least ruin the tyres of the trucks using them. So they arranged to sow the roads of North Korea with tyre puncturing devices. Nails. Caltrops. Simple, cheap, mechanical sabotage scattered from the air across the enemy's supply routes. It had a code name. It was called Operation TAC. The recorded result of that program, as documented in the post-war analysis, was that 4 South Korean civilians were killed and 2 trucks had their tyres punctured. 2 trucks. That was the state of the war in 1951, the most technologically advanced air force in the world, in complete command of the sky, and the enemy's supply system was so hard to touch that scattering nails on a road killed more friendly civilians than it stopped enemy vehicles. And the worst part, the part that would take American analysts years to fully absorb, was that the enemy was not improvising. He was executing a system, a very good one. There is a line from the period that says everything about how the American command felt about the men running communist logistics in Korea. Brigadier General Dar Al-Khair, the Far East Air Force's deputy for Materiel, said that commanders in Korea frequently remarked that the one man they would all like to meet after the war was the supply officer of the communist forces. How he kept supplies moving in the face of everything thrown at him, Al-Khair said, was a real mystery. That was not sarcasm. That was professional respect, and it was earned. Start with the timetable. Chinese and North Korean truck convoys did not move continuously. They moved on a schedule built entirely around the American day. Movement began at dusk. It continued through the dark hours. And it stopped as a matter of doctrine in the small hours of the morning, typically around 2 or 3 in the morning, specifically to give the convoys enough time to get clear of the road, disperse, and disappear before first light. Camps were established roughly 1.5 miles off the roadway, and the same camps were used again and again by successive units moving south. By dawn, the road was a road again. Empty. Innocent. A dirt track through a valley with nothing on it. Then add the light discipline. Drivers ran blacked out wherever the terrain and the moon allowed it. Spotters were posted along the routes to listen for aircraft, and when they heard engines, they signalled. Trucks pulled off the road, cut their engines, and waited. A convoy that heard an invader coming became within seconds a line of cold metal objects sitting motionless under trees and camouflage netting and cut brush, in a country where the mountains threw enormous black shadows across every valley floor. Then add the recovery capacity, which is the part that genuinely broke the American theory of interdiction. The manpower the communist side committed to keeping the roads and rails open was staggering. Chinese archives record roughly 600,000 civilian laborers supporting the war effort in Korea, and by the later stages of the conflict, something on the order of 500,000 Chinese People's Volunteer troops were engaged in labor and logistics work inside North Korea. This was not a repair crew. This was a national workforce assigned to the single task of undoing whatever the United States Air Force did the night before. The results speak for themselves. By December of 1951, North Korea could repair a cut rail line in under 6 hours. Bridges took 2 to 4 days. Where a bridge could not be rebuilt fast enough, they built another one beside it. Where they could not build above the water, they built below it, laying underwater bridges just beneath the surface of a river, so that a truck crossing them appeared from the air to be driving on water, and the structure itself was invisible to a reconnaissance camera. Then add the deception, which was the most sophisticated element of the whole system, and the one the Americans understood last. An enemy who knows exactly what you are counting can decide what you count. The Communist Logistics Organization worked out very early that the American night crews had no reliable way to assess damage. They could see fire. Fire was the entire basis of the American accounting system, and by the autumn of 1951 it was formally the basis because 5th Air Force had ruled that a vehicle had to be seen burning or exploding to be claimed, so the enemy gave them fire. Wrecked vehicles were left where they had been destroyed, sitting in the ditch beside the road, night after night, to be attacked again by fresh crews who had no way of knowing that the hulk they were shooting had already been killed a week earlier. Fires were set deliberately in the wrong places. Piles of straw and refuse were burned along the roadside so that a crew arriving at a strike area found the ground already lit with what looked exactly like the aftermath of a successful attack. The camouflage was not only meant to hide what was real, it was meant to advertise what was not. And it worked because the men in the aircraft were doing something the human eye and the human brain are simply not built to do, which is to distinguish a burning truck from a burning pile of nothing from 100 feet in 2 seconds at night while being shot at. And then there is the number that quietly destroys the entire strategic premise of the interdiction campaign. A joint intelligence study by 8th Army and 5th Air Force dated September 23, 1951, examined how much a Chinese or North Korean division actually needed to keep fighting. The answer was about 48 tons of supplies per day for a division of 10,000 men. An American division of 16,000 men needed roughly 500 tons a day. Per man, American forces required something in the order of 6 times as much material to stay in the field. The communist soldier in Korea ate less, carried more, fired less ammunition, expected less resupply, and could subsist for extended periods on what a single truck could carry for an entire company. The entire communist front line in Korea could be sustained by a trickle of traffic that would not have kept one American corps in business for a week, which produces an ugly arithmetic for the men flying the invaders. To starve a Chinese army, you did not have to reduce the supply flow. You had to reduce it to almost zero. Anything less than near total interdiction was not interdiction at all. It was inconvenience. And the enemy's plan rested on one assumption, and it was a completely reasonable assumption based on everything the world knew about air power in 1950. It was this: Americans cannot fight at night. Aircraft found targets with human eyes. Bombing was visual. Strafing was visual. Reconnaissance was photographic and therefore needed daylight. Every doctrine, every training pipeline, every piece of equipment in the American infantry assumed a pilot who could see the ground. Remove the sun, and you remove the Air Force. That assumption was correct. It was correct for almost a year. And the thing that eventually cracked it was not new. It was not secret. It was sitting on airfields in Japan on the day the war started, and the Air Force had already decided it was obsolete. The Douglas Invader was designed in the middle of the Second World War as a replacement for the A-20 Havoc. Its prototype first flew in July of 1942. It entered service as the A-26, and in 1948, when the Air Force reorganized its designations and abolished the attack category, it was redesignated the B26, which caused permanent confusion with the entirely unrelated Martin Marauder of the previous decade. By 1950, it was a 7-year-old design in a world that had discovered the jet engine. Nobody in the Air Force thought of it as the future of anything. It was a piston engine holdover from a war that had ended, and the service considered the type to be on its way out. But look at what it actually was. 2 Pratt & Whitney double wasp radial engines. 2,000 horsepower each, a top speed around 355 miles per hour, which had made it the fastest American bomber of the Second World War. 4,000 pounds of ordnance internally and another 2,000 pounds under the wings. A crew of 3, and in the attack configuration a solid nose packed with heavy machine guns, plus more guns in the wings, so that some invaders went into battle with as many as 14 forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns. Now consider what a night intruder actually needs. It needs to stay airborne over a target area for hours because it is not attacking a fixed target on a schedule, it is hunting. It needs to fly low and slow enough that a human being can visually identify a truck in the dark, and it needs to be docile enough at low altitude that the pilot can maneuver in a mountain valley without killing himself. It needs enough firepower to destroy a vehicle in a single pass because there may not be a second pass, and it needs the endurance to fly all the way to the interior of North Korea, loiter, hunt, attack, and get home. A jet fighter in 1950 could do none of that. Its fuel consumption at low altitude was brutal, its loiter time was measured in minutes, and it was moving too fast for a human eye to pick a blacked-out truck out of a shadow. The Invader could do all of it. The math was not subtle. An enemy that only moves at night can only be killed at night. And in the entire American infantry in the Far East, there was exactly one aircraft that could hunt in the dark for hours at low level, with the guns to finish what it found. At the outbreak of the war, the American invader force in the Far East was small. A couple of dozen aircraft were operational, concentrated in the squadrons of the 3rd Bombardment Group in Japan. They were in combat within days. Invaders were flying over South Korea on June 27th and June 28th, 1950, and on June 29th, 18 of them struck Haejo Airfield near Pyongyang, the first American bombing mission flown against North Korea itself, while more than 20 others hit the railroad yards at Munsan, just south of the 38th parallel, where the North Korean advance was already pressing down on the capital. The cost started immediately. On June 28, 1950, First Lieutenant Raymer Harding and Staff Sergeant William Goodwin of the 13th Bombardment Squadron were killed returning from a sortie. They were the first United States Air Force fatalities of the Korean War, and they were flying an Invader. The aircraft the Air Force had written off was going to fly the entire war. It would still be flying it in the last hour. But there is an irony buried in this that is worth stating clearly because it explains why the Invader ended up owning the night rather than choosing it. The B26 did not become a night bomber because someone brilliantly identified it as the perfect night hunter. It became a night bomber because it could no longer survive in daylight. When the Soviet-built MiG-15 appeared over Korea, the entire calculus for piston-engine aircraft over North Korea collapsed. A swept-wing jet fighter against a Second World War medium bomber is not a contest. It is an execution. The Invader was fast for a propeller aircraft and hopelessly slow for the world that had just arrived. Daylight deep interdiction in a B-26 became something close to suicide, and the aircraft was pushed out of the sun and into the dark. So both sides in this story ended up in the same place, for the same reason, at almost the same time. The North Koreans went into the night because American aircraft ruled the day. The American invaders went into the night because Soviet jets had made the day lethal for them too. The two enemies were driven into darkness by each other, and once they were both in there, they discovered they were alone together with a set of problems that neither air force in the world had ever solved. Nobody had ever fought a sustained industrial-scale war in total darkness before. Both sides were writing the manual from scratch in the same 8 hours of every night, over the same roads, but finding the answer and making the answer work are two entirely different problems, and the first attempts to hunt trucks in the Korean night were close to a total failure. The first difficulty was simply seeing anything at all, so the Air Force tried to make its own daylight. In the early experiments, heavy bombers went up carrying parachute flares left over from the Second World War, dropping them high above the roads while invaders orbited below, waiting for the ground to be revealed so they could attack whatever the light exposed. It was a reasonable idea. It worked badly. A great many of the surplus flares simply malfunctioned, and where the flares did ignite, the results were often worse than darkness, because a flare burning above a bomber crew destroys the night vision that crew has spent the better part of an hour building up. Crews found themselves half-blind, staring down into a pool of hard white light, surrounded by a void that was now blacker than it had been before anyone lit anything. The second difficulty was that the enemy simply refused to be there. A vehicle that hears an aircraft goes dark and stops. So the intruder crews found themselves flying a strange, maddening pattern in which they arrived over a road, saw headlights, dived, and by the time they were in a firing position, the headlights had gone out and the road held nothing but shadows. The third difficulty was terrain, and it killed people. Attacking a truck at night in Korea meant flying down a valley in mountainous country in the dark, often below 500 feet, and sometimes making the final firing run at around 100 feet. Vertigo and spatial disorientation are not abstractions at that altitude. There is no visible horizon. There are no lights. There is a black wall of rock on either side, and the ground is invisible until it is not. Crews were lost to the mountains without ever being touched by the enemy. Aircrew also reported that the enemy, understanding perfectly well what the Americans were doing, had begun stringing steel cables across the mouths of valleys to catch anything flying low enough to hunt. And in winter, when the ground froze hard, 50 caliber rounds fired at a shallow angle would ricochet up off the frozen earth and back into the aircraft that fired them. One Invader crewman, writing about strafing under those conditions, called it sheer lunacy. And the fourth difficulty was the one that would ultimately poison the entire campaign, and we will return to it because it matters more than anything else in this story. Nobody could tell what they had hit. Bomb damage assessment at night was, in the words of the post-war analysis, almost impossible. A crew fired at a shape in the dark. Something burned, or something appeared to burn, or something smoked, or something that had been moving stopped moving. The crew went home and reported what they had seen. There was no camera, no daylight photograph, no way to go back and count. The entire accounting system of the night interdiction campaign was built on the honest impressions of exhausted men flying at 100 feet in the dark at 300 miles an hour. That is not a scandal. That is a physical limitation. But it is the crack through which the number 38,500 would eventually escape from reality. By the middle of 1951, the shape of the war had changed. The front had stabilized roughly along the 38th parallel, and the fighting had settled into a static, grinding contest of positions and artillery. Truce talks had begun, and that changed what interdiction was for. It was no longer about stopping an advance. It was about preventing the enemy from accumulating the stockpiles he would need to launch a decisive offensive, and about making him pay for every shell he fired. The war in the air had become a war of attrition against a supply line, and both sides now understood the stakes precisely. The communist side responded by massively increasing the volume of night traffic, not reducing it, increasing it. The interior roads of North Korea, which had been empty in daylight for a year, filled after sunset with a river of vehicles that stunned the crews who flew over them. On the night of August 26th, 1951, intruder crews reported counting somewhere around 4,000 vehicles moving in the dark. Nobody had ever seen anything like it. 5th Air Force reorganized around the problem. From June of 1951, North Korea was effectively cut in half for night interdiction purposes. The 3rd Bombardment Wing, flying out of Kunsan, took the west. The 452nd Bombardment Wing, an Air Force reserve unit that had been called to active duty on August 10, 1950, in the first activation of an entire reserve air wing for the war, took the east from Pusan East Airfield. 2 wings, 1 country, every night. And in that period, the crews stopped improvising and started building a genuine tactical system, which is the most impressive thing the American side did in this entire campaign. They began by studying the light. Crews learned that trains and trucks required opposite conditions. A train running blacked out could still be picked out by moonlight because a moving locomotive on a rail line is a large dark object in a fixed corridor, and the moon puts a sheen on steel. So moonlit nights were good for hunting trains. But a truck on a mountain road at night, in country with no lights at all, has to use its headlights or it will drive into a ravine. So the darkest nights were the best nights for hunting trucks, because on a truly black night the enemy had no choice but to light himself up. The crews learned the geometry of the deception. A convoy hearing an aircraft cuts its lights and stops, but it cannot stay stopped forever, and the drivers can hear an aircraft receding as clearly as they can hear one approaching. So the invaders started hunting in pairs. The first aircraft would fly over the road loudly, deliberately, and continue on past. The convoy would go dark and freeze. The engine noise would fade, and the drivers, believing the danger had passed, would switch their headlights back on and start moving again. And at that exact moment, the second Invader, which had been trailing silently behind and low, would already be in its attack run on a road full of illuminated targets. They learned to attack the repair crews as well as the traffic. Delayed action fuses were mixed into the bomb loads so that some of the ordnance dropped on a road cut would detonate not on impact, but hours later, when the Labour battalions had swarmed onto the crater to fill it in. It was a brutal, cold piece of engineering, and it was aimed squarely at the one asset the enemy could not replace as easily as trucks, which was the men with the shovels. And they built the single most important night tactic of the war, which was called the roadblock. The concept was straightforward, and it was devastating. Instead of hunting a moving convoy, which was almost impossible, you attacked the road itself. You picked a heavily used stretch of highway, ideally in a valley where the terrain would not permit a bypass, and you cratered it at a chosen point after the night's traffic had already started rolling. Then you waited, because a road in North Korea was not a highway network. It was frequently a single track cut into the side of a mountain, and a crater across it meant the convoy behind it could not go forward, and, if the vehicles were packed nose to tail in the dark, could not easily turn around either. Traffic backed up. Vehicles bunched. Drivers stopped, got out, and started arguing about what to do next. And what had been a dispersed, disciplined, invisible column became a stationary line of trucks parked on a road, which is the one thing the enemy's entire doctrine had been designed to prevent. Then the invaders came back and worked the line from end to end with fragmentation bombs, rockets, and 14 machine guns. Sometimes a second crater was placed behind the column to seal it in. The trapped stretch of road was then sown with mixed fusing so that some bombs went off immediately and some went off later, into the rescue effort. The roadblock was, in effect, a way of forcing an army that had mastered movement to hold still for 10 minutes. The technology followed the tactics. Under a program called Redbird, a handful of invaders were fitted with an early infrared detector in the nose, developed to pick up the heat signature of a blacked-out locomotive at a distance. To make the sensor work, the nose of the aircraft had to be packed with dry ice for cooling, which gives you some idea of how far the state-of-the-art was from anything reliable. Radar navigation systems, chiefly the short-range navigation system known as SHORAN, allowed bombing through cloud and darkness with accuracy that was initially poor and later became reasonably usable, though it never approached precision. Flare-dropping transport aircraft became a standing part of the effort, orbiting over a target area to keep it lit for the strike aircraft. But underneath all of it, one problem refused to go away. Every one of these systems, in the end, still required a human being to see a truck. And so somebody in 5th Air Force asked the obvious insane question. What if we simply put a searchlight on the aircraft? It is worth sitting with how much of a violation of every instinct this was. The whole art of night intrusion was concealment. The whole reason the invader could survive over defended ground at 100 feet was that the gunners could not see it, and the proposal was to attach, to that aircraft, the single most visible object it is possible to carry into a night sky and switch it on directly over a target the enemy was defending with anti-aircraft artillery. But somebody did it. In the middle of 1951, under Colonel Niels Odman, the 3rd Bombardment Wing had searchlights fitted to a small number of its invaders. They were experimental. Very few aircraft carried them, and the men who flew them were flying in the most literal sense into a lit space of their own making, testing tactics that nobody yet knew would work. Which brings us back to the night of September 14th, 1951, and to a 31-year-old captain from Baltimore. John Walmsley had not fought in the Second World War. He had spent those years as a flying instructor, teaching other men to do what he would not get the chance to do himself, and he had come to Korea in June of 1951, joining the 8th Bombardment Squadron of the 3rd Bombardment Group as an invader pilot. By that September night, he had completed roughly 25 combat missions. He took off from Kunsan in an invader with a searchlight and flew deep, roughly 100 miles behind the front, into the mountains near Yangdok. His mission that night, in the words of the citation that would later be written for him, was a night combat mission flown with the objective of developing new tactics. He found an enemy supply train. He attacked it, and he disabled it. The train was crippled, and it was sitting there, and it was full of exactly the material that would otherwise be on the front line within days. And then his ammunition ran out. He had nothing left to shoot with. At that moment, the mission was complete by any reasonable standard. He had located a target in the dark behind enemy lines and put it out of action. Every incentive in the world told him to turn west and go home. Instead, he got on the radio and called for other friendly aircraft in the area to come and complete the destruction of the target. And when another invader arrived, Walmsley turned on the searchlight and used it to guide the second aircraft down onto a target it could never have found on its own, in a valley where the enemy had every reason to be waiting with guns. The citation is precise about what happened next, and it is worth following closely because it describes a man making the same decision over and over again. He aligned himself with the target twice, holding the light on it so that the attacking aircraft could see what it was attacking. He was, in the language of the citation, constantly exposing himself to enemy fire. And then, as the other invader set up its run, Walmsley took his own aircraft down into the valley at low level directly over the target, with the searchlight blazing. He refused to take evasive action. Evasive action would have broken the beam. Breaking the beam would have meant the other crew lost the target, and the target was a trainload of the ammunition and food that would otherwise be at the front within days. So he flew straight through the barrage with the light on. His aircraft was hit. It crashed into the surrounding mountains and exploded on impact. He was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. The two men who died with him were Second Lieutenant William Mulkins, his bombardier and navigator, and Captain Philip Browning, a photomapper aboard the aircraft. The fourth man, the gunner, Master Sergeant George Morar, survived the crash on the ground. He was captured by North Korean forces, spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner, and was released after the armistice. That is what one searchlight cost. And in the weeks and months that followed, the tactics that Walmsley died testing, along with the hunter-killer pairs and the roadblocks and the delayed fuses and the flare ships, produced an explosion of results that seemed, at the time, to prove that the Air Force had finally solved the night. The numbers climbed almost vertically. In July of 1951, night intruders claimed 750 vehicles destroyed and about 1,550 damaged. In August, the claims jumped to 1,935 destroyed and 3,633 damaged, including a single night, August 24th, on which crews reported roughly 800 vehicles destroyed or damaged in the space of a few hours of darkness. And then in October of 1951, the claim reached 6,761 vehicles in a single month. If those numbers were accurate, the war was effectively over. 6,761 trucks in 31 nights is a third of the enemy's entire estimated truck fleet, destroyed in 1 month. By aircraft the Air Force had considered obsolete. Sustain that rate and the Chinese and North Korean armies would be reduced to carrying artillery ammunition on their backs by the spring. That did not happen. And the reason it did not happen is the part of this story that almost nobody tells, and it is the reason we know with hard documentary certainty that the greatest truck-killing campaign in history was measuring something other than dead trucks. 5th Air Force knew. That is the crucial point, and it deserves to be said plainly because the temptation is to treat this as a case of an Air Force deceiving itself. It was not. The men running the campaign looked at the escalating claims coming out of their own night crews and did not believe them. In September of 1951, 5th Air Force tightened the rules of adjudication. From that point, a crew could not claim a vehicle as destroyed unless they had actually seen it burn or seen it explode. Not stopped, not hit, not smoking. Burning or blowing up. A truck that a gunner had walked 50 caliber rounds across and which then sat motionless and dark on a road was no longer a kill. It was an honest, self-imposed correction, and it is to the credit of the officers who made it. And the very next month, under the stricter rule, the claims went up to 6,761, which tells you that the problem was not primarily dishonesty. The problem was physics. Consider what a night intruder crew was actually being asked to do. It is dark. You're at 100 feet, doing 300 miles an hour in a valley at night, in an aircraft with 14 machine guns firing. There is a line of vehicles below you that you can see for perhaps 2 seconds. Things are burning. Fuel is burning. A previously hit truck that is still on fire from an attack an hour ago is burning. A haystack full of decoy material is burning. Your own tracer is bouncing off frozen ground. Another invader is working the same stretch of road from the opposite direction. And you must, in that instant, count. Now do it again the following night on the same road where the wrecks of last night's attack are still sitting in the ditch, and some of them are still smouldering, and some of them have been deliberately left in place by an enemy who has figured out exactly what you are counting. Then multiply by 60,000 sorties. The result is the number 74,589, which is the total vehicle destruction claim of the United States Air Force in Korea across 220,168 interdiction and armed reconnaissance sorties. Set that beside the estimated communist truck inventory in theatre, which was somewhere north of 20,000 vehicles, continuously resupplied across the Manchurian border. The claim exceeds the fleet by a factor of 3 or more. Even the official analysts of the period put the word vehicles in quotation marks when they wrote that figure down. And here is the confirmation that settles it, and it does not come from any American document. It comes from the front line. If the interdiction campaign had worked, communist firepower at the front should have fallen. It rose. Through 1952 and into 1953, Chinese and North Korean artillery bombardments of United Nations positions increased in both volume and accuracy. The communist forces were not being starved of shells. They were accumulating them. In the final 3 months of 1952, United Nations forces fired more than 3.5 million field gun rounds and more than 2.5 million mortar rounds against communist expenditures of roughly 378,000 field gun rounds and 672,000 mortar rounds. That is a lopsided ratio in the United Nations' favour, and people sometimes cite it as evidence that interdiction worked. It is evidence of the opposite. Because at the same time that this was happening, United Nations forces were under ammunition rationing, and communist artillery fire was getting heavier and more accurate as the war went on. An army whose supply lines are being successfully strangled does not fire more shells this year than last year. It fires fewer. The Chinese People's Volunteers built their strength in Korea to something on the order of 1.35 million men by the summer of 1953. That is not the profile of an army being cut off. That is the profile of an army being reinforced. Operation Strangle, the Great Rail Interdiction Campaign launched in August of 1951, ran to 87,552 sorties. It was credited with 276 locomotives, 3,820 railroad cars, 19,000 rail cuts, and 34,211 vehicles. And by December of 1951, the Air Force was acknowledging in its own assessments that the enemy had broken the rail blockade of Pyongyang and regained the use of his key rail arteries. 87,000 sorties and the trains were running again. The successor campaign, Operation Saturate, began on March 3, 1952, and applied a more concentrated approach, hitting short sections of track around the clock, fighter bombers by day and invaders by night, to prevent repair. The enemy responded by moving anti-aircraft artillery along virtually every rail line in the country. By the end of April 1952, Saturate was visibly failing. It followed exactly the same arc as everything before it. Initial success, then defeat by enemy countermeasures. The senior commanders said so at the time in their own words, and they were not being modest. General Otto Wayland, who commanded Far East Air Forces, assessed that the air campaign had stopped all but 4 to 5% of pre-war rail traffic in North Korea, and then added the sentence that undoes the achievement. That remaining fraction, he said, was sufficient to form a solid base upon which the enemy could add enough truck and human porter transportation to maintain a static supply line. 95% destruction of a rail system was not enough, because the enemy needed 48 tons a day. General James Van Fleet, commanding 8th Army on the ground, put it more bluntly. He asked how the Chinese armies in Korea could supply themselves in hostile territory 200 miles from their base in Manchuria in the face of the terrific interdiction program directed against them, and answered his own question. In spite of all the air and naval attacks, he said, their railroads kept them supplied, and they even built up reserves for offensive action. The scholarly verdict arrived at over decades and best expressed in Conrad Crane's study of American air power in Korea is the fair one. Air power in Korea was effective but not decisive. Without air superiority and interdiction, the United Nations position in Korea would very likely have collapsed. With it, the enemy was constrained, harassed, delayed, and made to pay a genuinely enormous price. But he was never strangled, and the number 38,500 did not represent the enemy's destruction. It represented the enemy's cost of doing business. And if you want the single cleanest proof that darkness, not technology, was the decisive factor in this war, you do not need to look at the interdiction statistics at all. You only need to look at what happened when the roles were reversed. The North Koreans, who had no bomber force worth the name and no ability to challenge American air power in any conventional sense, began flying night harassment missions over United Nations positions. The aircraft they used was the Polikarpov Po-2. The Po-2 was a biplane. It was made largely of wood and fabric. It had been designed in the 1920s as a trainer. It was so slow that its cruising speed was below the stall speed of the jet fighters sent to intercept it, which meant that an American jet trying to shoot one down could not fly slowly enough to stay behind it without falling out of the sky. It carried a handful of small bombs, sometimes thrown over the side by hand, and it came over at night, at low altitude, at walking pace, and dropped them on airfields and encampments. The Americans called them Bedcheck Charlie. They were militarily trivial, and they were maddeningly effective because they woke up entire air bases, forced blackouts, and kept exhausted men out of their beds, and at least one raid is credited with setting a large stock of fuel alight on the ground. And the most technologically advanced air force in the world, sitting on an inventory of radar-equipped night fighters and jet interceptors, could not reliably catch a wooden biplane flying in the dark. Across the entire war, only a handful of these aircraft were confirmed, shot down in air-to-air combat. The confirmed kills were scattered across an almost comic range of aircraft types, including Corsairs, Tiger Cats, a Sky Knight, a Sky Raider, and, appropriately enough, one shot down by a B26 Invader. Another was destroyed when an F-94 night fighter, slowing down desperately to stay behind its target, dropped below its own stall speed and collided with the thing it was chasing. Sit with that for a moment. The same darkness that allowed 20,000 communist trucks to defeat 74,000 American kill claims also allowed a wood and canvas trainer from the 1920s to defeat radar-guided jet interception. Darkness did not favor one side. Darkness favored whoever was willing to accept it as a condition of life instead of an obstacle to be engineered away. The North Koreans and Chinese accepted it. They built a national logistics system, a national labor system, and eventually a national defense doctrine on the assumption that the sun was a threat. The Americans never fully accepted it. They kept looking for the machine that would abolish it. The bill for the Americans was also real, and it was paid in the same currency the whole campaign traded in, which was aircrew, because the enemy adapted to the roadblock exactly as he had adapted to everything else. Once the Communist command understood which stretches of road the invaders were cratering, it stopped treating those stretches as vulnerabilities and started treating them as ambush sites. Anti-aircraft artillery was moved in and dug in around the known choke points, the valley mouths, the bridge approaches, the single-track sections where a crater could not be bypassed. The very terrain that made a roadblock effective was the terrain that forced the attacking aircraft to fly a predictable line at a predictable altitude from a predictable direction. And the guns got heavier and they got smarter. Radar-directed heavy anti-aircraft artillery appeared along the rail corridors. Ground searchlights, directed by radar rather than by ear, began sweeping the valleys, and an invader caught and held in a searchlight beam at low altitude in a mountain valley had very few good options and very little time to choose between them. So the same choke point that trapped 100 trucks in 1951 had become, by 1952, a kill box with the Americans inside it. The tactic had not stopped working. It had simply started working for both sides. As communist anti-aircraft defenses along the roads and rail lines thickened through 1952, the exchange rate turned against the intruders. Colonel George Brown, the 5th Air Force Director of Operations, wrote in that period that the Air Force was trading invaders for trucks in a most uneconomical manner. That is one of the more honest lines an operations officer has ever committed to paper. A B-26 with 3 men in it was being exchanged for a Soviet-supplied truck carrying a few tons of rice and shells, and the truck was easier to replace than the crew. The 452nd Bombardment Wing alone, the reserve wing called up in the first weeks of the war, flew 15,000 sorties in Korea, 7,000 of them at night, and lost 85 crewmen. In May of 1952, the wing was inactivated, and its aircraft, its equipment, and its people were absorbed into the 17th Bombardment Wing, and the war went on exactly as before, which is what happens to reserve units. And the crews kept flying anyway, and they got extraordinarily good at it, and almost none of them are remembered. Take one crew from the 3rd Bombardment Wing, working the rail lines in the winter of 1952 and into 1953. Major Vernon Todd. First Lieutenant Herbert Covell, flying an Invader he had named for his wife. Second Lieutenant Eugene McIntyre. Airman First Class Arthur Andrzejewski. In a span of less than 5 weeks, that single crew was credited with destroying or damaging 18 locomotives and nearly 100 boxcars. That is a remarkable record by any measure of aerial warfare. 18 locomotives is a meaningful dent in a rail system, and unless you have spent time in the archives of the Korean Air War, you have almost certainly never heard any of those 4 names before this sentence, and you will probably not hear them again. And the men themselves went where men like this always go, which is nowhere. George Morar came home from a North Korean prison camp. John Walmsley was buried at Arlington. His Medal of Honor is real, his citation is a matter of public record, and his name is on the Wall of Remembrance at the Korean War Veterans Memorial. But there is no monument to the night interdiction campaign. There is no famous photograph. There is no film. The men who flew the Invaders spent 3 years doing the most dangerous flying of the war at 100 feet in the dark, in the mountains, in an aircraft the Air Force had already labelled obsolete, and they did it in a conflict that the United States would spend the next 50 years calling the Forgotten War. The last act was theirs, at least. An Invader of the 3rd Bombardment Wing flew the final American bombing mission of the Korean War, releasing its bombs in the closing minutes before the armistice took effect on July 27, 1953. The aircraft that had flown the first mission of the war flew the last one. And here is the thing that should genuinely unsettle you, and it is the reason this story is not a piece of antique history about propeller aircraft. The problem was never solved. North Korea learned the lesson of 1950 to 1953 more thoroughly than anyone else on Earth, and it has spent the 70 years since then building a country designed around it. The lesson was simple. American air power cannot destroy what it cannot see, and the answer to American air power is not to shoot it down. It is to go underground. The United States estimates that North Korea today has somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 underground facilities. That figure was reported in a South Korean military journal in July of 2015 and has been repeated in open source assessments since. Command posts, factories, aircraft shelters, supply depots and troop shelters built beneath ordinary-looking buildings. 21 North Korean air bases have underground facilities. Along the border, North Korean artillery sits in hardened positions tunneled directly into the sides of mountains, guns that roll out to the cave mouth, fire, and withdraw into solid rock to reload. That is not a fortification. That is the North Korean answer to the B26 Invader cast in concrete. Between 1974 and 1990, South Korea discovered 4 infiltration tunnels dug under the demilitarized zone. The third of them, found in 1978, ran roughly 1,600 meters and lay about 73 meters below the surface, cut large enough to move thousands of troops per hour beneath the border. The doctrine of moving in the dark, unseen, has become the doctrine of moving beneath the ground, unseen. It is the same idea with a roof, and it is a live problem right now. In March of 2025, the annual Freedom Shield exercise conducted by American and South Korean forces included 4 days of dedicated underground warfare training at Paju, about 20 miles from the border, with more than 370 soldiers working alongside multi-legged robots and hand-sized drones designed to go into tunnels that human beings cannot safely enter. In October of 2024, North Korea blew up its own sections of the road and rail links, connecting it to the south, physically severing the surface routes. The surface has never been where the important things move, and the deeper pattern, the one that runs directly from a Korean valley in 1951 to the present day, is the problem of the mobile target. In 1991, during Operation Desert Storm, the coalition went hunting for Iraqi Scud missile launchers, which were mobile, which moved at night, which hid under highway overpasses and in culverts, and which looked on an infrared sensor exactly like an ordinary truck. Roughly 2,500 sorties were flown against them. Pilots claimed dozens upon dozens of launchers destroyed. The post-war Pentagon assessment could not confirm the destruction of a single mobile launcher. 40 years after Korea, with jets, with precision munitions, with infrared, with satellites, the United States Air Force found itself flying thousands of sorties against a handful of trucks it could not reliably see, could not reliably hit, and could not reliably count. The launchers kept firing. The claims kept climbing. The post-war audit found nothing. The technology that was supposed to finally solve it was the ground-moving target radar carried by the E-8 surveillance aircraft, which flew its first operational mission on January 14, 1991, and spent Desert Storm tracking vehicles in the dark from high altitude. That fleet has now been retired. The last of those aircraft left the American inventory in November of 2023, and the satellites intended to take over the job of watching things move on the ground are not expected to begin launching until 2028, which means that right now, today, the United States has a recognized gap in exactly the capability the Invader crews were trying to improvise with a searchlight and a pair of human eyes in 1951. The problem has outlived every machine ever built to solve it. So look again at the number. The number is not a lie. Every one of those claims was made in good faith by exhausted men doing something almost no human being has ever been asked to do. It is a measurement of something real. It simply is not a measurement of trucks. It is a measurement of how much effort a modern air force will pour into a target it cannot see. It is a measurement of the distance between what an honest man can report at 300 miles an hour in the dark and what is actually lying in the ditch when the sun comes up, and it is a measurement of the one thing the Chinese and North Korean logisticians understood in 1950 and the Americans needed 3 years to accept. You do not have to defeat air power. You only have to outlast it, one night at a time, with enough men and enough shovels and an army that can live on 48 tons a day. John Walmsley turned on a searchlight over Yangdok because there was no other way to show another crew where the target was. That is the entire war in one image. The most powerful air force on Earth reduced to holding up a lamp in the dark and paying for the light with 3 men and an aircraft. North Korea is still in the dark. It is still moving, and the light has still not found it.